Sam, welcome.
Thank you so much. Great to be chatting with you.
Do facts have a half-life?
I would have to say yes, given the the title of the book that I wrote called The Half-Life of Facts. I mean, the way to think about it is, obviously, what we learned in our textbooks might no longer be true anymore. And things. I mean, as we do science, we learn new things, and sometimes things become obsolete or get overturned. But it turns out, kind of underneath all of that tumult and kind of constant shifting of what we know over time, there are regularities. And so the reason I kind of use the term half-life, and then other people do this as well, is by analogy with radioactive materials. So if I were to give you just a single atom of, I don't know, uranium or something like that, um, you would not be able to tell me when that atom is going to actually decay. It could be in the next fraction of a second. We might have to wait, I don't know, millions of years. But everything changes when we take a whole bunch of atoms and put them together. We get an entire chunk. Then suddenly things actually become regular and systematic. And the same kind of thing actually can be true with scientific knowledge. There are actually regularities to how what we know grows and changes and becomes overturned over time, and how we root errors and things like that. So in that sense, yes, there are these kinds of regularities to how facts change.
Were you able to get an estimate for the actual half-life of certain types of facts? Like how many years do we have to wait till half of them are considered no longer true?
So, and different people have done different analyses for this kind of thing. The clearest one uh, was someone was looking at, I think, facts in the, like, I think it was like the hepatitis and cirrhosis literature, kind of so related to the liver. Um, and they took a whole bunch of papers and they gave them to a series of experts, and they said which of these are true, based on the abstracts, I think, and then which ones have been overturned or otherwise rendered obsolete. And they were actually able to to create to actually chart out a curve. And maybe it's still somewhat metaphorical, but from them they actually said, oh, it's like about 45 years where half of these things become obsolete or otherwise not true. There are other ways of measuring it. You can also say, oh, when do certain scientific papers in certain fields only get, I don't know, half the number of citations over time or whatever it is. And so there are regularities. Whether or not the half-life is always being used more or less, kind of the same way you would use how you would think about like radioactive materials. That's a whole separate thing. But yeah, there are people who have looked at how different fields have actually changed over time. It could even just be like, how long does it take for, I don't know, the literature to double in size in different fields? And so different fields kind of have these different half-lives, similar to the way different radioactive materials have half-lives as well.
If I think about how I would model facts in science, I would imagine that some of them are going to get overturned with a kind of fixed probability of being overturned each year, right? Like maybe, any particular fact might have a 1% chance that we discover it's wrong. But that if you were to then, draw that process out, there'd be some stable set that are like never going to change, right? Because they're just like actually totally correct. And so no matter how many years out, they're just kind of a fixed set. Is that kind of how you think of it as well?
I would say yes, but kind of with some caveats. Like in general, I think the closer we get to kind of the core of what we know, the less likely those kinds of things are going to be overturned. And so when you look at things that are sort of at the frontier of knowledge, that's where we know the least. It also happens to be the worst, where the most exciting things are happening. But that's where a lot of that turmoil happens. That being said, there are situations where things where we sometimes think they are kind of in that core can be overturned. So, for example, my grandfather, who is a dentist, he actually learned the wrong number of human chromosomes, which is kind of crazy. But it turns
Oh,
out there was
wow.
this period in, like, I don't know, I think it was like the 1930s or the 1950s, where we had microscopes and like various visualization techniques that were good enough to see chromosomes, but apparently not quite good enough to actually count them accurately. So he learned that within human cells, there were 48 chromosomes instead of 46, until there was a better technique, and then it was actually rooted out. And so there are situations where those kind of things can happen. But I would say, by and large, when it comes to things that are maybe that seem more certain or kind of closer to the core, they are less likely to be overturned. But I think overall, we sort of need to have in mind that science and scientific knowledge ultimately is in draft form. So I was talking to a professor of mine from graduate school, and he told me this story where he he had come into the class, to some class to lecture, I think on a Tuesday, and he taught some topic, and then the next day actually read a paper that actually overturned everything he had taught the day before. And so then So then he went back into the class on Thursday, the following day, whenever he was lecturing, and he said, "Remember what I taught you? It's wrong. And if that bothers you, you need to get out of science." And so there's this idea that like science, like it's not necessarily just this kind of body of knowledge. It's really much more about a rigorous means of querying the world. And sometimes, because everything is in a draft form, we are going to learn lots of new things that invalidate what we have thought was true before. And oftentimes it's much more at kind of the frontier where things are changing a lot more, but occasionally it can be a little bit more in the core.
Seems to me that there are quite different types of knowledge being overturned. As an example, there's a famous quote that says something like, one theory is that the Earth is a sphere, another theory is the Earth is flat. They're both incorrect, but they're incorrect to very different degrees, right? The Earth is much closer to being a sphere than it is to being flat, whereas in fact it's not a perfect sphere, right? So that's kind of one kind of overturning of facts, is that we kind of just refine the fact, right? We say, oh, it's not actually a sphere, it's it's oblong, it has these slight irregularities, right? But you're still like, okay, but it's not exactly overturning it; it's sort of more revising it.
Yeah, and so yeah, the quote you're referring to is actually from Isaac Asimov, where I think someone wrote to him and said, right, like we used to think the Earth was flat, and then we thought it was a perfect sphere, and now we know it's like the oblate spheroid, kind of like the squished sphere, and so therefore, how can we know anything? And his response was like, if you think both of these things are equally wrong, then kind of your version of the world, your understanding of the world is wronger than both of them put together. And I think and actually Asimov even I think looked at the amount of error for each of these, and so because even though they are qualitatively different mental models of the world, in terms of how we would use them practically, they actually have like error relative to the true shape of the Earth. And he shows that we are in fact getting closer and closer. And I think that is the right way to think about these things, right? Just because knowledge is being overturned or we're learning new things about the world doesn't therefore mean that everything is subject to being overturned at any one moment, and therefore we're kind of living on these shifting sands of knowledge. It's much more about like asymptotically approaching the truth, that as we learn, we are going to overturn things, but presumably this is all part of this process of getting closer and closer to a true understanding of the nature of the cosmos or whatever specific thing you're actually trying to understand.
It seems to me that there's another way that a fact can, quote, change, where it's actually due to shifting definitions. So an example of this is you might say, well, what is the rate of autism in the population? And well, the answer today is very different than it was 50 years ago. But my best understanding of the situation and talking to experts is that largely that's due to redefinitions of what autism is, plus improved screening, right? So it's like but if we take just sort of the redefinition piece, like sometimes the words just don't mean what they used to mean.
Yeah, and sorry, I can't speak to that example, but I would say, right, like certainly we do redefine things over time. So, for example, when Pluto got demoted, it wasn't as if, oh, suddenly Pluto no longer existed in the solar system. Because we discovered new objects in our solar system that were in fact kind of on the order of the same size as Pluto, well beyond where Pluto was. We realized, oh wait, there's actually this whole category of objects out there, and so in that case, right, and then we kind of redefined what Pluto was, but it didn't change what Pluto was.
Oddly, it's like it wasn't even really information about Pluto itself, as far as I understand it, right?
Right, whereas information about other objects in the solar system, but at the same time, though, but I think, but this is actually one of the things you're pointing to, is that oftentimes better measurement techniques, or the way in which we define things or we measure the world around us, will actually lead us to differing understandings of the world. So, for example, as we've gotten better and better at measuring, I don't know, the heights of mountains, we've realized, okay, we now have a better understanding of the height of Mount Everest, but we also now know that the height and the location of Mount Everest is actually shifting a little bit. So one of the things I think a lot about is the way in which measurement techniques goes hand in hand with learning new things about the world, which is also very interesting because often measurement techniques are bound up in technological advancements. So, for example, if you have better and better techniques for smashing atoms together in particle accelerators or whatever, you're going to learn new things about the world. And those better particle accelerators, the advances go hand in hand with technological advances. And so there's this very interesting relationship between the scientific knowledge we have and the technological advancement, and kind of how these things are related in terms of what we think about the world and kind of trying to understand it. But you're right, when I talk about like knowledge changing, there's a lot of different categories that I kind of collapse. One of the reasons I collapse them all in some ways is because it often has to do with how we perceive the knowledge. So, for example, this could even be so like one fact that is changing is just the number of billions of people on the planet, and like that's just changing because we are reproducing and people people are having babies faster than people are dying, and so the globe is actually growing in terms of its global population. The interesting thing there, though, is we we often when we're young, we learn a lot about lots and lots of different knowledge and lots of different topics. So we learn about geography and different areas of science and things like that. And then as we get older, we kind of specialize. And the information in our heads often gets kind of frozen when we were younger, when we were kind of first learning those kinds of things, independent of whether or not the billions of people on the planet are changing, whether or not we now have better understandings of dinosaurs.
Yeah, that
So
was
for
to say
example,
dinosaurs are the classic example.
totally. I mean, like, yeah, when I was young, I learned about yeah, dinosaurs were kind of these like weird kind of gray-green reptilian monsters, and now they're like I don't know, fearsome chickens. And that's the kind of thing where like, you don't realize that information is changing until I don't know, your kid comes home and says, "Guess what? Dinosaurs have feathers and look totally different, and they're brightly colored." And I think the same thing is even with like these facts that we would assume are changing, not in terms of like the state of the world, but like, or I guess in this case, the state of the world, like the number of billions of people. Because there was actually someone told me this story where I think it was like a hedge fund manager or something like that. And this is a number of years ago, but he was saying he was at some dinner or some meal and said like, oh yeah, like of course that makes sense because like as we know, there are only like 4 or 5 billion people on the planet, and of course like that hasn't been true for quite some time. But people often are just stuck in the earlier information that they learn. And so it often kind of only proceeds almost like generationally, like until you're confronted by the new generation that's learning all the new information, that then you have to kind of revise and rethink how these things teach you about the world.
Some facts we kind of know when we learn them that they're temporary. Right? We know that they're not like what's the temperature today? We know that's going to change.
Yeah.
But something like the population of the world, it changes slowly enough that like your brain can kind of be like, oh, I've remembered that. I don't need to update it. Is this related to what you call, I think it's a mesofact?
Right. So this is exactly that. Like there's lots of different categories of knowledge and based on like the speed at which they change. And so you have the things that change really rapidly, like yeah, what the weather's going to be like tomorrow, or what the stock market closed at. And then you have that's kind of like the very rapid thing. And we're pretty good at recognizing those things are going to change. And then you have the other extreme of I don't know, learning the number of fingers on the human hand or the number of continents on the planet. Like those things, we don't really have to worry about them shifting. But then there's this whole category of knowledge of things that are changing on the order of decades or on the order of a human lifetime. And yeah, and those are kind of like the mesoscale. So these are the mesofacts. And those are the hardest ones to update because we often learn them alongside all the things that really never change. And then we forget to update them. And that becomes very, very difficult to grapple with.
There's one more category of fact that can change that I think is really fascinating, which is that sometimes we derive conclusions about the nature of the world from what we know. And a great example of this is when people believed that Newtonian mechanics was true, they looked at those laws of physics and said, well, the world is a clockwork universe. Like if you know the initial conditions of particles, you know their positions and velocities, you can predict exactly what will happen. So everything's deterministic, right? And so it's like that was not so much something that like people directly observed. It was just sort of a conclusion that they drew from the facts that were known at the time. And then quantum mechanics comes about, and people are like, oh no, that's not true. Actually, probability is like inherent to the fundamental nature of reality. Now, of course, maybe that will one day change. Like I think people are pretty confident that probability is actually fundamental, but like who knows? There could be another new theory of physics that lets us see how it's actually not probabilistic. It's really hard to say. But it's sort of like we want to sort of draw sweeping grand conclusions from the facts that we have. And sometimes those conclusions could actually, even if our facts are close to accurate, like Newtonian mechanics works really well, the conclusions might be extremely wrong.
Yeah, and certainly, and the interesting thing with Newtonian mechanics is that even though you're right, they're not entirely the way the world works. My sense is if you're a civil engineer and building a bridge, you're not using quantum mechanics because at that scale, it doesn't make any sense. So you're actually using much more kind of Newtonian bits of knowledge. But I think what you're talking about is kind of when we have these new theories that become the sort of the cutting edge version of knowledge, we then use that more broadly, even if you're outside of the field of physics, as kind of this larger framework for thinking about the world.
Yeah, exactly. It influences people's view of sort of the world itself or how things
Yeah.
operate.
So I was gonna say this actually reminds me a little bit of how people have thought about just like the brain and the mind over time, where it's like oftentimes it'll be the brain is described by like the cutting edge technology of the day of like I don't know, people saying maybe like perhaps like the brain is like a steam engine or the brain is like a clock or the brain is like a computer or whatever it is. And the truth is, and the brain is like a brain. Sometimes we can kind of draw analogies to those other kinds of things, but it's kind of its own thing. And so for me, I think these theories or kind of these like theoretical frameworks for understanding the world, they're very good. They can be useful as like mental models. But as long as you kind of have a set of mental models and don't necessarily anchor on, oh, because this is the newest thing about how this specific instance of the world works, we're now going to draw grand sweeping conclusions. So for me, it's less about the way in which science is changing and more about how like cutting edge scientific discoveries are kind of filtered into the popular imagination. And that, I mean, to be honest, I'm not really sure how best to think about that. It's more just it's almost like some sort of cautionary tale of like, okay, like because these ideas are really interesting, they're powerful, we have to sometimes be even more aware of how we use them. Because so like for example, even like the idea of evolution. Evolution is a incredibly powerful model for thinking about lots of things outside of biology, but it's still ultimately, in many cases, like a metaphor or an analogy. And it can be useful for at least giving you some insight, but you kind of don't want to really push that metaphor too far before it kind of bends and breaks. And so, yeah, so for me, it's more just like have a lot of mental models, hold them a little bit loosely, especially the farther away you are from the specific area in which they were developed.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It does seem like certain scientific developments lead to new understandings of society that are sort of like loosely based on the scientific development. Like, you go from evolutionary theory to like social Darwinism, which is like actually not an implication of evolutionary theory, but it draws on a lot of the sort of metaphorical ideas of it. Or you have the new developing field of economics, and suddenly new social systems are constructed, and people say, well, look, economics proves that the optimal society is like this or like that, which is like sort of, but it's again, it's a sort of it's quite a bit of a leap from from what the theory is actually telling you to the sort of the social view.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of the idea of like, I mean, even in those specific fields, they're going to be probably an approximation of the real world, and then certainly as you get farther and farther away, that analogy and equation of those of reality and this model are going to break down. And so I kind of view it as like the way in which people just talk about models more broadly, which is like every model is some sort of simplification, where it's like all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think there's like there's some sort of quote about that.
George Box, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so the idea is, I think we kind of have to think about all these as models, and the question is, how useful is it for gaining some understanding of the specific area of the world that you're trying to understand? And sometimes the answer is, okay, it actually is pretty useful. But other times you're like, okay, it's a fun thought experiment or a fun kind of analogy, but it could be so oversimplifying that it's like it could be useless or verge on dangerous.
We've talked about different reasons for potential skepticism about so-called facts. What do you think the right attitude is to have in light of this?
Yeah, for me, I mean, going back to what I was saying earlier about kind of this like idea that ideally we are asymptotically approaching the truth. So I would say like recognize that scientific knowledge is kind of in draft form, but also that presumably as an endeavor we are acquiring the world better and better and kind of getting closer. But for me, I think we need a certain amount of just like epistemic humility when we kind of approach these kinds of things. And so the idea that um, like we don't necessarily know everything, and that's okay. And I think, and you see this both in kind of the realm of like scientific knowledge. You see this actually in the world of technology, where we kind of think, okay, if we apply our rationality to understand the world, like especially for systems that we ourselves have built, we should be able to understand them. And increasingly, and certainly with AI and things like that, it is becoming more and more revealed and true that we don't fully understand these systems. They are incredibly complicated. And so the computer scientist Danny Hillis, he actually referred to kind of us moving from like the Enlightenment, when we kind of like apply our rationality to understand the world around us, to the entanglement, where everything's so hopelessly interconnected that we can't fully understand the world around us. And so whether or not that's entirely accurate, I still think, and I do think, and we are building systems that we can't fully understand. Um, but more broadly, when we think about scientific knowledge and kind of the nature of the cosmos and the world around us, whether it's our technological systems, we don't need to be in one of two states of like either like perfect understanding or complete ignorance. And I think most people, when they see knowledge being overturned or certain systems or situations we don't fully understand, they immediately think, oh, we don't fully understand it, therefore we don't understand anything. And the truth is, that's not how it works. Like there is a whole lot in between complete understanding and complete ignorance. And I think that is where, for most of human history, we lie. And we have to kind of recognize that we are moving closer and closer and better and to better and better understandings, but we have to have a certain amount of humility of recognizing like we are finite beings. We have made unbelievable advances to understand the world around us, but there's going to be situations where we might not fully understand it, and where there could be, and whether it's like thinking about certain ideas like mathematical chaos and in terms of prediction, whether or not it's just recognizing that certain bits of knowledge in the realm of science have been overturned over time, or even just trying to understand the systems we ourselves have built in the realm of technology, we're going to fall short every now and then, and that's okay. And so for me, it's much more just kind of having that, in my mind at least, almost like a refreshing sense of humility that I think is actually going to be most productive in terms of understanding the world going forward.
It seems to me that science denialism can latch onto this, where it's easy to point out examples where scientists were terribly wrong. You can always find examples of fraudulent science, and in any large enough field, there'll be someone who's a fraud, right? You can find examples where scientists overclaimed, like they made it seem like they knew something and didn't. And then if you kind of cherry pick these examples, it's like pretty easy to paint a picture of like, well, we can't trust science, we can't trust scientists. Therefore, and then like usually what they leap to is sort of something that we have way less evidence for, you know?
Yeah, and I think part of the problem there is, right, if you think of like, oh, like science is like big T truth, and then we notice some cracks in it, then then suddenly people are like, oh my God, like, and we thought this food was good for us, and now we think it's bad for us, or this, like, how can we know anything? And you kind of just like throw your hands up in despair. But for me, um, I mean, it really just shows that ultimately, I mean, and science is done by people. It's a deeply human pursuit. And scientists are humans, and we are imperfect. Um, but the fact that science is this endeavor, this kind of like rigorous means for trying to understand the world better, um, it's going to have hiccups and things that we overturn along the way, and presumably scandals and other kinds of stuff. But it's a self-correcting sort of mechanism, and I think that's the thing that makes me think like you have to like a healthy dose of skepticism is good. It's the unhealthy dose of skepticism that is bad. And so trying to kind of create that balance, I think, and sometimes certainly if you're coming from outside the world of science, it seems hard. But for me, it's much more about, I mean, yeah, like we should trust science not as the body of knowledge, but much more as the process of kind of trying to get better at understanding the world. And yeah, and it's going to be at the frontier. That is where we know the least and where things are going to get overturned. But that's also where the most exciting things are happening. And so recognizing that, I think, can be sometimes inspiring to try to understand that kind of thing. And going back to like the draft form science, like it's always in draft form. And I think, and maybe this is like a temperamental thing, like certain people get really inspired by that and want to actually add to the body of knowledge and make it better and better. Some people, when they hear it's a draft form, get really worried. And so I'd love it if we can kind of take that sort of like the scientific mindset of how scientists approach the world as in draft form. We're constantly getting closer, we're constantly improving, and find some way of actually exporting that to the larger population. I think that would be really healthy and really, really exciting.
Yeah, maybe people are a little worried about putting the drafts out too quickly because then again that can feed into this, well, you told me this, but it's actually not true, or and actually I think sometimes scientists have a negative reaction when colleagues get too much attention for something that's like a really new paper or something like that, when it's like rather than the sort of the ideas that have really undergone the really rigorous testing that still haven't gotten that much attention.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a trade-off there, and certainly there are situations where maybe when you're trying to explain things for a popular audience, there's a tendency just to try to kind of remove all of the caveats and kind of the nuance of science and like the uncertainty and say, okay, like this is a new discovery. It's subject to the following conditions. There's a lot of things we haven't worked out yet. Here, we also need to, here's like the further work that needs to be done. Unfortunately, that's harder to, it's harder to articulate when it kind of gets like filtered through popular media sometimes. I'd like to think though that that's not entirely true. I'd like to think that that society as a whole has space for nuance and recognition of these kinds of things.
Would you like to think that, or do you actually think that?
I I'd like to think that. Perhaps I'm being hopelessly naive and just and like overly optimistic, but I don't think it's one of these things that is like impossible to convey to a broader audience. And part of that, and going back to the sense of excitement, like that, like there is excitement in the new and the novel and the uncertainty and an experiment well crafted and all these kinds of things. And the downside is right that some of these things don't necessarily work out or there's experiments that can't be reproduced or whatever it is. But that's all just part of the process. And I think for me, going back to what we were saying earlier, when you kind of conflate science with the body of knowledge and the process of learning new things, that's when sometimes that messiness kind of breaks down. Because if it's just a body of knowledge, then you have to be really certain and you can't talk about that whole process. But if it's a process of learning new things, then there's a lot of space for all that messiness in there, which for me is really exciting. But it's something, when we kind of conflate those things, then it gets a little collapsed.
Sometimes I can feel frustrated by both the science denialist crowd and the like rah science crowd, because they both seem to be perceiving science in sort of these stark, inaccurate ways. Like, clearly the science denialists are like, scientists are all lying to us and it's all bullshit, whatever. Obviously not true. And then, but the people who are like rah science, I think they actually want to treat science like it's much more reliable than it is. And also, I think that they often fail to recognize that there are pockets of science or of scientists that are not doing what I would call science. Like, if you think about this ideal of a process, that process is not always being done by scientists, right? And so, we hope that scientists are doing this process, but, you can point to examples in history where it's just not happening.
Yeah, and certainly, right, you want that process to actually be observed or be used. It's not always happening. Or people are just like making grand sweeping claims without necessarily the data or the insight to actually kind of buttress those kinds of things. I think I mean, ultimately, how would I say this? And I think the fact that science has within it the mechanisms for self-correction, I think makes it very powerful.
It does if it's followed in the right way, right? It does. But that's why I think that sometimes breaks down. Like, I think there are pockets of science at different points of time where it no longer has the self-corrective mechanism.
So, like, what examples would you give for that?
Well, to me, the best example is there was a period of maybe like 10 to 20 years in psychology where I think a lot of the research was just not true. And in fact, you can see this because you can go redo the studies from scratch and you don't get the same answer. Like about 40 to 50% of the time, you do not get the answer they got if you redo the same experiment.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, right. Like, I think you're referring to kind of like the whole like the reproducibility crisis kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so for me, I mean, one of the interesting things actually. So when, one of the things I mentioned in my book, The Half-Life of Facts, was I think I kind of mentioned this idea around where we want people to actually try to reproduce experiments, but by and large, you don't really get as much credit for just reproducing someone else's experiments. And I was kind of defeatist there of like, oh, maybe these things are not going to happen. I have to say, since I wrote that part of the book, I have actually been very gratified to kind of be proven wrong, that like a lot of people have actually done a lot of really good work around trying to reproduce this and kind of and clean up like parts of science where maybe there was a little bit more messiness or lack of reproducibility. So I think I mean, it seems as if we are increasingly getting better mechanisms in science by and large. And certainly sometimes it'll take kind of like a little bit of a detour and things will kind of maybe go wrong.
And on the longer time scale, it is.
And so that maybe that's the time scale I often think of, is just kind of like when you take a step back and kind of look at the larger picture, you're like, oh yeah, like I mean, and even if you like go back in the day where and people are doing things around like on like the miasma theory of disease or certain things around like the like was it luminiferous ether or whatever that was kind of in the vacuum of space. These things are not real science. They've been overturned. But there was a long period where we kind of had these ideas. But if you take the longer view of science, I think it does seem as if it does have these kind of self-correcting mechanisms.
I think it's worth sort of asking what makes science work. Like, what are the features that are necessary, and what are the sort of optional stuff, right? Like, it's optional, I think, to have academic journals work exactly the way they do today, but it's essential to have people being able to figure out what exact experiment did you do, and then they can actually go redo it themselves and check that it works. And if it doesn't work, they can tell everyone, right? So it's like, you don't need it to work exactly the way it does now, but you do need some kind of mechanism where people are trying to redo each other's experiments, and the information of whether they were able to redo it like gets spread widely.
Yeah, no, I agree, right? Like there are certain details of how science is done, right, that are entirely contingent based on like the development of the research university and things like that, that you could still do science even without those kinds of things. But then you're right, but there are other kinds of things that are fundamental to that self-correcting enterprise of like, right, the ability to share results, provide enough information that your work can be reproducible, have kind of this way of, I mean, not it doesn't need to be like citing like scientific papers, but having basically this conversation across things where people are building upon other people's work so that you're not off like you're not always starting from scratch. And I think even certain elements of providing credit, I think that also can actually be important because in terms of like incentivizing people to do certain kinds of things, the details though they all matter. When I think about like how we could redo science or kind of expand how science can work, I think of like there's like this massive space of like these are all the things that are valuable for science. And the truth is, like, you often have like this kind of little subset area of like, here are the things that are valued by scientific academia. Of like, here are the things that get you tenure. And the truth is, like, there's still a lot of things that are actually really important for science. Of like, I don't know, building software tools or doing kind of weird interdisciplinary research or just helping people out in labs that might not necessarily get you credit, but they are vital for the scientific enterprise.
I think the measurement issue you mentioned before is a huge one, that a lot of scientific progress is kicked off by better measurement tools. It's like, imagine how much you can understand about the human body when you don't have any tools to look at it compared to like you get an MRI, you get a CAT scan, you get ultrasound, et cetera. And suddenly like it just opens the door to understanding things at such a more granular and more interesting level. And I think a lot of areas of science, that's essentially progress was limited until a new tool unlocked the next sort of area of understanding, because it opens up suddenly a ton new data that then you can build new theories from, and you can refute old theories.
Oh yeah, no, and I definitely feel like this kind of thing is like right, particularly true in biology. Is like as we have better like microscopy techniques for like visualizing things within a cell or whatever it was. And I actually remember this might have been when I was in college. I read the obituary of some well-known scientist. I think he might have been a Nobel laureate, and it mentioned kind of in passing like, oh, he discovered certain like cellular organelles. And it was one of these things where I had thought they had been known for like hundreds and hundreds of years, like since like the advent of like the early microscopes. And then I was kind of floored that this person who only had like died when I was in college, had actually discovered these things. And so, right, there's a lot of things that sometimes are newer than we might realize. And and presumably it's because of these kind of advances in measurement techniques. And I don't remember the exact details of that one, so I don't remember exactly how it worked. But yeah, oftentimes, right, you have like better telescopes, and then suddenly you're understanding new things about astronomy. And certainly with like the advent of like the radio telescope, that was the way in which we got evidence of the Big Bang. And like before we had those kinds of things, and you could maybe hypothesize, but they didn't actually have a way of measuring these kinds of things. And so, or at least as far as I'm aware, maybe it could have been done with. And now I'm actually rethinking how it could have been done. But I would say an overall, right, like measurement tools and techniques seem to go hand in hand with increasing amounts of knowledge and increasingly better ways of understanding the world.
Yeah, it seems like part of what they do is they unlock a bunch of new data that you can then hold old hypotheses against, and also like study to try to come up with new hypotheses. But also they often control situations much more cleanly, allowing more cleaner experiments, right? Where you can kind of do a more precise test than you could do before. imagine if you can control a laser, you can now you can do experiments you couldn't do before. If you can make the measurement the really precise level, whereas if you can only make a vague measurement, limits the sort of precision of your experiments.
Yeah, I think that's also related to like certain things around scale. Like the kind of more precise you have, you can kind of delve into like deeper, like more precise spatial scales, or even if you have better ways of measuring speeds or clocks, and that actually will have impact. It will have an implication for how we like look at smaller time scales. And so I think, and then you have certain things with telescopes, like much vaster spatial scales, and or even temporal scales where you're able to essentially look backwards in time because things farther away, or like the light takes a while for it to come to Earth. And so, right, that kind of that increase in measurement technology, right? Like the more precision also changes the kind of scales we can even ask questions about.
Now, shifting topics a little bit, you've called for a new type of research organization. What kind of research organization do we need that we don't have?
To be honest, I don't have a specific type of research organizations. I just think we need to actually be expanding the kinds of organizations we explore. So the way I kind of think about this is when you look at the places research is traditionally done. So it might be done in the research university, maybe it's done even in the corporate industry labs, or some types of like university adjacent independent research institutes, or sometimes even in tech startups. The truth is, those are just like a few points in some weird high dimensional space of potential institutions. And we should actually really be exploring that. And like finding out, like, are there other institutional forms and other organizations that are in this weird high dimensional space that could actually unlock different kinds of things? So I mentioned before about here's like all the space of things that are valuable for science, and here's the subset of things that get you credit to get tenure or whatever it is. We need organizations that incentivize all those other different types of activities. And gratifyingly, over the past, I don't know, I mean, there were ones even before that, but over the past like few years, there's actually been an explosion of new types of institutions where they're trying lots of different things, where they're maybe working more interdisciplinarily as opposed to kind of along department lines. They're maybe like funding people rather than projects, or projects rather than people. They're maybe distributed. They're working in areas that are maybe not quite as able to be studied in traditional university settings. And so for me, I view it as this like unbelievable Cambrian explosion of like lots of new institutional forms. Now, the downside of a Cambrian explosion is oftentimes there's a lot of extinction events. And so I think some of these institutions might not necessarily last for the long term. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure which ones are going to last, but I just love the fact that people have begun experimenting with new types of forms. We definitely need more, but yeah, there's already hints that there's some interesting things happening.
Are there certain signs to you that we need more? Like, are there some things you would point to that say, hey, look, our research organizations are not doing the job they need to do, and there's a gap here?
So, I mean, there's certain kinds of and so there's both a gap. So maybe like certain things in terms of like bridging the space between um, like technological spinouts and basic research, where maybe it's able to be done in the university setting, but sometimes it's a little bit harder.
It's
Sometimes
like
there's kind
building
of
a startup based on some
yeah, so like that would be
science
one.
breakthrough. Yeah.
Yeah, and but the truth, and that's like one example of maybe there's spaces for like new types of institutions, and I've seen some stuff there. But there's also just like different kinds of like different fields sometimes, or there's like a new field that maybe is harder to do within traditional academia, and so it needs something outside of traditional academia to kind of act as sort of a galvanizing force. So, for example, and this is an older one; it's not in the past few years. I think it's been around since the 1980s. The Santa Fe Institute, which kind of is sort of the flagship institute for complexity science and kind of like studying large complex systems. And so the idea behind it is like independent of whether or not, I mean, obviously like biological systems are special in their own special way, and social systems are as well, and different, and lots of different like, technological systems. But it turns out if you abstract the details away and look at kind of the interactions among all these complex systems and all their components, there are actually interesting mathematical or computational insights that can be gained, and there are regularities that can be understood by kind of looking at the similarities between these different things, as opposed to just kind of staying within specific disciplinary domains. And so certainly like the field of network science is certainly one area that the Santa Fe Institute has been very involved in, kind
And
of
they do a
looking
lot
at
of complexity science too, right?
yeah, it's complexity science, network science, a lot of these different kinds of things. And so whether or not it's truly it's like whether or not like complexity science is like truly like a scientific field, I think having something like a Santa Fe Institute or in other domains, some other kinds of thing, like other organizations kind of outside of the traditional disciplines, provides a place where people can kind of explore in sometimes ways that jump across different domains and fields without necessarily having to kind of fit as cleanly within a specific department, let's say.
Yeah, I've definitely felt the friction of crossing academic boundaries. For example, sometimes in psychology work, which we do a lot of, I feel like, oh, we need a philosopher here because we're coming up against something where we're not even like quite sure what we're measuring or like what question we're asking. And it's like philosophers actually tend to have more skill at that kind of like disambiguation question than a psychologist typically does, where they're more like looking at like trying to study facts about the world. Or another example, there was this philosopher who really wanted to understand Occam's razor, and in his quest to understand it, he started bumping up against some mathematical problems, computer science problems, and much to his credit, he ended up having to teach himself a bunch of math and computer science. But now his papers are hard for his philosopher colleagues to read because they're written now in these like foreign languages to philosophy, right? So I actually, just the fact is the universe doesn't give a fuck about how we divide up knowledge. Like knowledge, what I mean? It just, we create these very arbitrary boundaries. And in the search to answer a question, you might cross multiple of these kind of knowledge boundaries based on the way we divide things up.
Right. Yeah. And back in the day when everyone was just kind of natural philosophers or whatever it was, and they really didn't care about disciplinary domains, it was a lot easier. I mean, that being said, I think, expertise in like deep expertise is really, really valuable, but either the ability to bridge different domains and so kind of bring people from different fields together and actually say, oh, you actually have something valuable to share with each other. And if you can kind of overcome the jargon barriers, you can actually learn something new. I think that's really, really powerful. Or occasionally, sometimes being able to do that kind of thing within a single individual, like someone who's maybe a little bit more of a generalist. So sometimes people like talk about this idea of like the T-shaped individual. So you kind of have like the vertical part where someone is like very like deeply steeped in some specific discipline, but they're also comfortable kind of being in the bar of the T, kind of jumping across different domains. And I think there's something to be said for kind of cultivating people like that, whether it's like generalists or T-shaped individuals or polymaths or whatever we want to call them. I think we do need ways of allowing them to thrive in kind of the world of research. And sometimes in our current organizational structures, it's a little bit harder for those kinds of people to do that.
Right. When working on a PhD, generally speaking, you have to kind of pick a point on the boundary of knowledge and just say, okay, I'm going to become the world expert in that tiny little thing, right? That's like, I'm the world expert in my PhD dissertation topic, And,
Exactly.
but that's often just so narrow.
Right. And that's the kind of thing of like, right, like we've created the university structure and like the PhD structure to really create really deep experts. And yeah, and going back to what I was saying earlier, like that's good. Like I don't think we should get rid of experts. We kind of need that, but we also need other ways of doing these kinds of things or experts plus. And so yeah, trying to find mechanisms for that kind of thing, I think is another one of those areas in terms of like where there's a gap maybe in kind of the organizational space. And there's others as well. So like there's also just the way in which people think about building research or almost even just like allowing people to kind of move back and forth between the world of research and maybe non-research. And so, for example, like right now, if you leave academia in many domains, it's very hard to kind of get back in. But there should be ways of kind of allowing people to maybe, I mean, I mentioned like the tech startup world, for example, but like it could be like you work on some research, then maybe you leave and work on a company, and then you come back and do some more. That's hard to do. One actually interesting organization, this is in kind of the computer science realm, it's called Ink and Switch, and they do things a lot like kind of at the realm of like human computer interaction. But the way they describe how they operate is they describe it as sort of like the Hollywood studio model. So in the same way, like when you make a movie, you bring a ton of people together who work on that movie for around 3 to 6 months or whatever, however long it is, and then they go off and work on their next project. And you kind of bring them together for a set period of time. They work on it and then they move on. That kind of thing doesn't really exist that much in kind of the research world, but especially in the tech world where there's a lot of people who like top-notch talent you might not be able to entice to say, okay, come here for 5 or 10 years and work on some research project because they're top-notch talent. They might want to go start a company or do other things, but they often have a few months in between. Maybe like they got a company acquired and they're taking a few months off before they figure out their next thing or whatever. These people could then be enticed for a short period of time to come work on a project. And so ink and switch, that's one of the mechanisms in which they kind of do their work is they'll say, oh, come work on us, come work with us for some time limited amount of time on this research project. And they have some people who are more, I think more permanent, or people who are kind of like figuring out like the larger shape of the research program they want to build. But because they kind of use this studio model, it allows them to have people engage with research who might not otherwise be able to do so.
Another topic that you've written about is this idea that we need a new philosophy of technology, or we need to think about it differently. What is philosophy of technology?
So, I mean, very broadly, I mean, like philosophy of technology is, yeah, kind of, I mean, thinking about like the nature of technology, how it grows and changes, kind of how we think about these kinds of things, like how it fits into our society. And so for me, when I think about certainly like computing and computation in particular, I think of it as, I mean, it should not just be this kind of like branch of engineering. It really is this almost like humanistic liberal art that when you think about it properly, it touches upon language and philosophy and biology and art and how we think in all these different kinds of areas. And so for me, I almost think about it by analogy with the field of philology, which really no one really talks about anymore, but it was kind of this like early humanistic domain where it was devoted to studying the origins of words and kind of the relationship, and like there's etymology, and but in the process of doing philology, you also had to do history and anthropology and linguistics and maybe even some archaeology, and it was kind of this like like all-encompassing field, and then eventually kind of split and branch off into lots of different things within the humanities. And maybe I'm just kind of maybe I really just enjoy kind of the idea of computer science very broadly and computing, but I kind of think that computing and computation has the possibility of being that kind of all-encompassing thing in sort of the philology way. And so for me, that's one of the things that I spend a lot of my time thinking about. And, yeah, and certainly my most recent book, The Magic of Code, kind of delves into kind of how to think about code as this kind of all-encompassing sort of thing that, one, it's just fun to think about, but ideally, if you have this broader perspective on computing and technology more broadly, it can actually, at least in my perspective, give you like a better and healthier approach to how you think about how technology engages with the human.
So a lot of people view coding as a very technical subject, right? And computation is maybe even more technical. So what's the case that this is actually like a very limited way of looking at it, that it's actually much more humanistic?
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at like the history of computing, and oftentimes like the people who were who were involved in computing, they weren't, I mean, they might have really been fans of computers and the actual details of computation, but they were also really devoted to thinking about what computing allowed you to think about. So it was like, so there would be people like early on in computing thinking about the computer as a tool for thought, or I mean, and so like certainly by the 1970s, Steve Jobs was like discussing the idea of like the computer as the bicycle for the mind, and the idea behind this was that I think it was based on reading a Scientific American article. Like there was a chart in it where it was talking about I think energy efficiency of different animals, and they had lots of different animals, and I think like humans were kind of mediocre, and like an albatross was maybe more efficient, or some bird, or I don't know. But then they also had a human with a bicycle, and suddenly the human with the bicycle beat all the other animals because we were much more efficient. And so his idea was like, oh, a computer is kind of a bicycle for the mind. And so whether or not it's that, or certain ideas around simulation or education, computers, I mean, they are this kind of right, computing and code can be this kind of like very esoteric domain, but it's really in service of all these other kinds of things. And so there's the TV show *Halt and Catch Fire*. Are you familiar with the show?
No.
Okay, so it was a show. Maybe it was like about maybe it was a decade or so ago. It was 4 seasons long, devoted to kind of the early like personal computing industry, and it follows kind of like a few different characters and kind of moves through I think like beginning in 1980 through like the early to mid 90s. And I think it was in the first episode. One of the characters is talking about computers, and they say like computers aren't the thing. They're the thing that gets us to the thing. And I think we've kind of forgotten that computers are like, they're meant to make us like the best versions of ourselves. Like it's not just like cool like tech and gadgets and wizardry. And like there is a lot of that, but it's really ultimately in service of making us the best versions of ourselves. And like whether or not it's like
I think a lot of people
allowing
who check Twitter all the time don't feel that way.
correct. And like that, and I think right because we've forgotten that, and that like we've kind of like slouched into this like really bad version. And so like for me, like when I think about or like when I think about like the current conversation around technology, it feels very broken because like it's just we talk all about like being adversarial towards technology or being worried about it or just being ignorant about it. And I think based on the thing like Twitter or social media or things like that, a lot of those concerns are actually very valid. But like when I think about like my own experience and like childhood growing up with computers, there were certainly like concerns and like things like that. But it was also like it was just a lot of sense of like wonder and delight. And like there was like SimCity and I don't know the early Macintosh or Commodore VIC-20 and fractals and all these just weird and like screensavers. These were these were spaces for wonder and delight. And I'm not and it's not to say that computing is like one or the other, but it should just be a lot broader than I think the the conversation that we currently have has like sort of narrowed the space of like just kind of viewing technology as this thing we need to be wary of. We should be, and certainly I have many, many concerns around certain technological advances and how we use smartphones and certain things around AI. But if we kind of say, okay, rather than just taking things as they are or predicting where these technologies will go, and instead say, okay, no, no, let's figure out the way in which computing can make my life more fulfilled or more meaningful or whatever it is. And then kind of work our way backwards and say, hey, what would those technologies look like? Then I think we're doing some really interesting things. And the truth is, if you look at the history of technology, there are a lot of people who kind of thought about that, and I feel like we've lost some of that driving purpose behind like the building of these things.
Yeah, it seems like today people tend to view like computers and smartphones more around either efficiency, like it makes me more productive, or time wasting, like, oh, it's like what I do when I'm, have a few minutes extra free time and I just want to like zone out, or, what I do after I'm tired from work or whatever. So I mean, it's an interesting reframe to think of it as like, how do you use technology to give you meaning? Like, what do you think some of the best uses of it to bring meaning are?
So like when I think about um, when people talk about AI, people will sometimes say, "Oh, like it's great that it can do all these things, but here's like the following things that only humans can do." And so therefore, like that kind of makes it special. And of course, like 10 minutes later, those things are out of date. And it actually reminds me a little bit of there's this idea within kind of like theology of like the God of the gaps. This idea that like, oh, like what does God consist of? It consists of all the things we can't yet explain about the universe. And of course, as we learn more about the universe, that definition just kind of like evaporates and kind of and vanishes. And I think we kind of do a similar kind of thing when we think about like the uniqueness of human beings, whether or not it's like comparing us to other members of the animal kingdom of like, oh, like we're the only ones who can use tools. Then we suddenly realize that other animals can use tools, or the same kinds of things with AI. And so for me, it's much more about like what is like the quintessential nature of humans? Like what is kind of the things that make me feel fulfilled and meaningful? And and so like certainly one thing that I think is useful is like I like thinking, and like thinking is interesting. To kind of like roll ideas around in my mind is really interesting. And so the certain tools like with it, like AI tools that allow me to kind of stitch together different ideas or surface papers or articles or ideas that I otherwise would never have known about because of jargon barriers or just because of the fact that the world has so much knowledge. I think those kinds of things are really useful. But I also think about the ways in which we use technology to kind of and maybe bring us closer to nature or to other people, not in the sense of like, oh, social media brings us closer to people, like human connection was the key and we're going to gamify human connection. But and there's work where people are kind of building almost like physical compute all computers are physical, but it's like the idea of like physical computing where you have pieces of paper that are being manipulated on a table where there's like some sort of like projector and camera that's like projecting things on and the camera is kind of reading it. And so and it's almost not only is it very physical and feels very tangible. And so the people working on this, so there's Dynamic Land working on some of this kind of stuff, and there's people building this project called Folk Computer as well that are kind of working on similar kinds of things. Not only is it deeply tangible, but it also is actually very communal. There's something to be said for rather than a and the people who I think promote this kind of thing, this is what they talk about. It's like a computer, like the kind of traditional computer is like everything is through a screen, and it's kind of this like very like isolating experience. But when you're in a physical space and manipulating things, then it has this really interesting potential for actually bringing people closer together because they actually are physically closer together. And so there's those kinds of examples. I'm sure there are other ones as well. Whether it's like certain so like one another example that I find really interesting is around just kind of like the creative coding movement of kind of like building little computer programs that are artistic. And I think that is like a new form of creativity that really was not possible before computers came around, where it's kind of this idea like that you kind of take the very nature of the computer seriously, which is this like thing that might not necessarily be that smart, but can do lots of like a huge number of calculations so much faster than any human being could ever hope to do. And when you combine that with certain bits of math, you can make really cool images and animations and things like that. And that just gives us a new window into thinking about art. So I think there's lots of different windows and ways of doing this. I don't want to necessarily say that there's any single way that people should derive meaning and purpose. I think that's one of the interesting things about kind of the human condition is sometimes we have to kind of struggle and figure that out for ourselves. Like what do we find most meaningful? But I do think that no matter what answer you find, I think there are ways of using computers to help enhance that rather than diminish it.
It seems like with AI, in theory, we could be unlocking sort of new ways of being creative with computers. In practice, I don't know how much it's doing that because if you just say to generate a beautiful photo of XYZ and then it generates a beautiful photo, it doesn't really feel like you've been creative. Like it really feels like you talked to an artist and then they did all the work rather than like whereas if you could give like a 2-page description of exactly what you wanted and then it produced something to your spec, maybe that would feel more creative. But how do you think of these kinds of ideas interacting with the sort of the new AI technology?
Yeah, I mean, certainly with like with the image generation, I think, excuse me, yeah, with the new types of AI, like the image generation technologies, I think we can have there can be interesting discussion and debate about like, yeah, what part is actually creative, what is not. I do think though that a lot of these things kind of like they raise the abilities of people who might not otherwise ever be able to generate those kinds of things. So, like for example, like if I'm not an artist or not trained as an artist, but I can begin to find ways of taking some sort of somewhat vague idea in my mind and instantiate it into an image, that's actually pretty powerful. Or the fact that in the course of figuring out how to use these, and certainly when people were talking about prompt engineering, it forces me to learn about the types of keywords I need to use that are descriptive of different I mean, artistic genres and historical moments in art or painting or whatever it is. It actually teaches me a whole bunch. I think that's actually really interesting. And I would also say, I mean, one of the other things that I think is really powerful is the way in which we're also democratizing the generation of software. Because like oftentimes historically like software has kind of been this domain of like, oh, it's like you need to be a professional programmer or a software developer, and those are the only people who can kind of build these kinds of things. But software, but oftentimes when it's only professional, it means that the only kinds of software that gets built, or maybe not only kind, but a very common type of software that gets built is the kind of software that is able to be used for a huge number of people. Because anything less than that doesn't necessarily seem as cost effective. Like you can't just build something for a small number of people or just for yourself. You can if you're yourself a programmer, but if you're trying to build something more, it's very hard. And so there's actually the novelist Robin Sloan. He has this essay with the title something to the effect of "An app can be a home cooked meal." And this idea of like we don't necessarily like just like how like cooking doesn't need to all be like industrial size or at the restaurant level or at I don't know the stadium level or some like some very large number of people. You can also be making a meal for yourself or your loved ones. The same kind of thing should be true for building software. It should be able to be built. You should be able to build software for yourself or for your family or whatever it is. And for a long time, and people have tried to build these kind of no code or low code kinds of things. And there's been interesting moments throughout kind of computing history. But I do think with the current moment of like generative AI that allows for vibe coding or other kinds of like spinning up these things, it allows people to like go about their day. And if they were not a programmer, if they noticed certain needs in their lives, that could maybe be solved by software, they would kind of have to shut down that portion of that portion of their brain because they couldn't build it. But now they actually can. They can, and I think that is enormously valuable and powerful and democratizing. And maybe it's not quite as creative in certain ways, where they're maybe not struggling with an algorithm or how to describe things. But I think overall, it's an unbelievable good for being able to kind of unleash that sort of creative power and this kind of idea generation of like actually being able to build software for whatever you might need.
An idea I've been experimenting with is trying to use these song generators, not to make a song that's good, but to make a song that's sort of the perfect song for my brain.
Oh, I love
And
that.
sort of just going through an iterative process of like continuing to tweak it and tweak it and tweak it with the AI tools and like just using how much did my brain enjoy listening to that. And like I've been pretty impressed about how well I could like begin to optimize it. And it's funny because I've like played it to other people and they're like, oh, I don't like that. And I'm like, oh, that's fine. But even still, the tools feel somewhat limited. Like they don't feel quite powerful enough, but I feel like they're beginning to get there where you could do that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole idea. Like, you now have the potential for whether it's building software or creating songs or whatever it is. Like, we can make things bespoke, like for ourselves. Like, it can be the kind of thing, right, that speaks to you. And so, if I have an idea, right, for a computer program that really only is interesting to me, like, I don't have to worry about the size of the market or things like that. I can now just build that kind of thing, and that's really exciting. And yeah, and the same thing with the songs. Like, I can build a song. You can build a song just for yourself that kind of like tickles your brain just right. And you don't have to worry about if this song has mass appeal. In fact, it sounds like you kind of don't want it to have mass appeal. You want it to be the thing that has the appeal of like an audience of one, which is great.
Yeah, it's kind of a fun idea that everyone could have like their own perfect bespoke song or image and it could be something sort of special to us. Do you think in this world of vibe coding where AI can do more and more that people should even bother learning to code anymore? Do you think it's like becoming antiquated?
So I don't think it's quite becoming antiquated. I mean, certainly you can build sophisticated software without necessarily knowing kind of traditional coding tools. It seems based on just kind of like examples that I've kind of seen out there in the world. I definitely think that if you have more coding knowledge, you can often it actually makes it that much more powerful. It seems as if my sense is that the people who actually know how to program, they're the ones actually able to build things really, really fast and really, really powerfully because they're kind of able to combine both this sort of like supercharging aspects of the AI along with this deep knowledge. But I also think about coding as it is also just I mean, the kind of traditional view of coding and programming is a really interesting kind of aspect of computational thinking. And I think there's something to be said. So in the same way that people might use calculators, but there's still something to be said for learning arithmetic. I think maybe there's the same thing with coding, but at the same time, I would also say that, and ultimately, what coding consists of has also just been a moving target throughout computing history. I mean, I say throughout computing history, we haven't had modern digital computers for that long. But even so, I mean, when I learned how to program, I didn't learn like how to, I don't know, flip switches on a computer or plug things in or use machine code or binary or even assembly code. I learned various kind of higher level languages. And the truth is the languages that I learned, they're not necessarily the ones that people use now. And of course, vibe coding is a different sort of thing. I think ultimately they're all part of this process and kind of larger tradition of taking some idea in your head and being able to instantiate it in some sort of rigorous way into software. And so, what coding consists of, it's going to change. It already has changed. I do think there's something to be said for learning certain kind of more traditional computer programs because I think you actually learn interesting things about language and computers and how they operate. And I actually think you'll be a more successful user of some of these kind of generative AI tools when it comes to software. But yeah, but coding has always changed, and so I am very hopeful and excited about that constant shifting view.
Yeah, and I think you're right that with the current AI models, you really get more out of vibe coding if you already understand the basic concepts and you can actually code yourself. Because the AI might hit a wall and you really need to get yourself unstuck. You have to like understand what's going on, or you may need to make fine tunes yourself. But obviously this stuff is moving really fast, so we don't know what's going to be like in 2 years.
Exactly.
But at least at the state of the art, I think that's true. You've mentioned before that you spend your time trying to catalyze the adjacent possible. What does that mean?
Yeah, and so the way I kind of think about it, I mean, so the adjacent possible is this idea first developed by the scientist Stuart Kauffman, which is the idea of okay, what is I mean, the possible is dependent on the current state of the world in terms of like technologies, for example, or the adjacent possible of scientific knowledge is dependent on what we already know. And so the idea is that if we can kind of get to what is possible and make it actual, then of course you can kind of keep on making more things, and then it opens up new realms in this high dimensional space of potential inventions or technologies or whatever it is. And so when I think about catalyzing the adjacent possible, the idea is in the process of catalysts and enzymatic reactions is really kind of like lowering that activation energy, kind of making it easier to find things in that kind of adjacent possible space and make them more likely. And so this is kind of going back to kind of we were talking about like high dimensional space of possible institutions. There's also kind of a high dimensional space of potential inventions and technologies and ideas. And we need better ways of kind of exploring this high dimensional space. That being said, I don't necessarily think it's that. It's not like there's a map of like, oh, I want to get to this kind of thing, and so therefore I need to find faster and faster ways of getting it or more efficient paths. For me, the way I kind of view this is much more along the lines of this great book by Ken Stanley and Joe Layman called "Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned," and their argument is basically when you have a high dimensional space that you're searching, trying to actually get directly to some end goal is actually a really bad way to do this. Instead, what you should do is think about it as like optimize for interestingness or novelty, and then take those things that you discover or new advances you make, these kind of stepping stones as they refer to them, and then productively recombine them. Which also means that you're often going to end up with technologies and ideas that will be used in surprising and unexpected ways, as opposed to saying, oh, like these things are clearly being developed for this specific reason. So, for example, the vacuum tube. The vacuum tube was developed far before kind of the ideas of like the modern digital computer. They ended up being repurposed and used for early digital computers, but it was because they were used, I think, in areas around like audio processing and like sound processing, and then eventually were kind of repurposed for certain things. And I could even be getting that wrong. But oftentimes we just need these like a larger space of stepping stones to all be used or to be out there. And so for me, when I think about catalyzing the adjacent possible, it's more like, okay, how can we get more people doing really interesting kinds of things? And actually, and this also is related to my role at Lux Capital. It's a venture capital firm. And venture capital is not, and we're not the ones innovating. We're essentially midwives to innovation. We're kind of making innovation that much more possible. And so that's kind of the way in which I think about some of my own role more broadly in terms of like science and technology is like, how can we just get all these ideas to become reality that much faster?
And what are some of your initial conclusions about how to make it faster?
So I am far from systematic. And going back to kind of the idea of like not having that kind of systematic path, I think it's much more about finding things. So I would say there's kind of two paths. One is just finding things that are really interesting and trying to highlight them. Or I feel like I spend a lot of my time kind of connecting people together and being like, oh, you're doing something interesting. You're doing something interesting. You guys should be talking. And this is like going back to what we're talking about in terms of like kind of the interdisciplinary approach or like overcoming jargon barriers. I think there's a great deal of power in that kind of acting as sort of like connective tissue between different ideas. And so I would say I spend a lot of my time doing that kind of thing. But I also know like when it comes to like thinking about the future, it's really hard to make predictions. And I know I personally am like bad at it. I have this memory of when my first book came out. This is years ago now. I was so glad that it came out then. I think this is like 2012 because I was certain that like very soon in the future, all books are going to be digital and there would be no print books. And I'm so glad I got my book like in print before everything became ebooks. And of course, I was wildly wrong. And so for me, it's much less about trying to predict the future and then just kind of like, I don't know, make technologies that will make that kind of thing faster and much more about, okay, what is the kind of world that I want to live in? Going back to what we're talking about with computers is like computers should be really for people. Like, I think there's something to be said for taking some time to think about, okay, what is the world that I want to build? And then how can I make that more likely? And I think so that coupled with just kind of this like connective tissue for lots of different ideas, I think those are the different ways that I think about that kind of thing.
Some people think of innovation and creativity as happening through have three methods. One is replicating. You're taking something that is already out there and you're kind of putting a little tweak on it, maybe making it slightly better for some purpose. The second is remixing. You're taking two or more ideas and saying, well, what if we took this property of this idea and that property of this other idea and squish them together? And the third is reusing, saying, hey, we're doing this thing over here. What if we did it over there, right? We use this idea in this other place. And you can find, for any of these, you can find lots and lots of examples of replicating, remixing, and reusing. Do you think that like kind of captures what innovation is, or do you think that's overly simplistic?
I definitely think it captures a lot of, I mean, because like I feel like one of these things like, yeah, like the remixing and like the sort of like creative recombination. I feel like that really is a very powerful idea in terms of how we think about technological advancements and innovation more broadly. And I'm sure there are like, things that feel entirely novel, but more often than not, right, there is this kind of combinatorial approach. And so the more that we can kind of put things together or figure out new uses, I think it actually is really powerful, which actually is one of the reasons why I think about the history of technology a lot, because I mean, right now in like the tech world, a lot of folks in like the Silicon Valley tech world, they're kind of ignorant of tech history, sometimes proudly so, because it's like, oh, like only the new thing that is the thing that matters. But the truth is, understanding the path dependence or the contingency or finding the things that people have already done in the past and then figuring out ways of like why they were not quite ready then, but maybe could be reused now or remixed or whatever it is. That's really powerful as a means for innovation. And so I definitely think what you're talking about, it rings true as very powerful features of innovation, which is why, yes, certainly when I think about tech, like we need more historical knowledge of technological history as well.
It's fascinating to think about cases where like technology regresses, right? Where instead of, you always think of technology as moving forward, but sometimes it doesn't. Like a great example is supersonic flight, where we had supersonic flight and we lost it as a society, which is really crazy. And there's like a company, I think it's called Boom Supersonics, trying to bring it back. But it's like really crazy that sometimes these things go backwards. Like, do you have like thoughts about why we sometimes lose technologies?
So in that case, I feel like in that one, my sense is like there was certain things around like safety or legislation that kind of limited like the Concorde and then eventually,
I think the original Concorde and those other supersonic flights, they were like government projects. And so some people have said in that particular case that the fact that they were government projects and not sort of designed to make money created a weird thing where they like lost tons of money. And then eventually the governments were like, okay, well, we're going to shut them down. They're losing lots of money. So it wasn't sort of like building an actual sustainable business model.
So yeah, I don't know the details of that one. I know there was also like there were certain things around like legislation around like limiting the like supersonic flight over land due to sound and things like that. Even though I think better technologies maybe change that. I don't know all the details, and I'm probably getting some of them wrong. But I think, but at the same time though, I don't think we didn't, and so we might have lost like the technologies in terms of like them being used in kind of our everyday, but I don't necessarily think we didn't lose them as a society. It wasn't like we forgot how to make supersonic flight.
I don't know. Like obviously on some level, like in the physics, we still understand it. But I heard a rumor that like people from the old like Concorde projects, like they were like the only ones that knew how to do certain things because they'd spent like, a decade figuring it out. And then it's like the one guy is now 85 years old who like figured this out,
Oh, that's interesting. So that I don't know. I mean, it does remind me actually in the realm of like just tech and certainly like computing more broadly of just like the whole like legacy system and legacy code where like you have systems that are built upon things that might be decades and decades old where the people who built them are long retired or even dead. And like someone told me some story. I think they were working at like the Los Alamos National Labs where they do like these like large scale like computational simulations around like nuclear explosions and I think he said something to the effect of like he would come across not infrequently large chunks of code with comments around it saying, "Do not touch this. We don't know what it does." And so I definitely think there are situations like that.
I think they're often written in Fortran,
yeah,
and
right.
And people are like, "What the heck is this? We don't know, but we've been using it for 20 years."
Right,
yeah.
like, and like we're not going to touch it. It does the thing that we need. And so in terms of like, so I'm not sure how to and draw a larger conclusion of in terms of like knowledge loss. I think it more just speaks to the fact that by and large, like the paths of technological advancement are far more contingent than we might realize. We kind of think of like, oh, like technological progress is like this like wave that kind of like washes over us. But it's not. It's dependent on people making individual choices to keep on advancing things and make choices to update software or not update software, or to continue building things in a certain way or not. And so for me, that provides a sense of oh, like technological progress. It's not this thing. It's not like this force or this thing you kind of pour over like innovation and suddenly we get new things. It's like it is something we have to choose to do as a society, and it's the sort of the accumulation of a lot of different individual choices and innovations and advancements to kind of move things forward.
As a final note, we've talked a lot about a lot of different topics today. Is there anything you'd like to leave the listener with?
I would leave just with a sense of like wonder and delight when it comes to science and technology more broadly. I think we like in this moment where people can sometimes be concerned about, oh, like scientific advances are being overturned and maybe we don't understand as much as we do, or technology is a great cause for worry or despair. There is still so much to delight in and to be excited by. And maybe this is kind of my own temperament that I kind of have a more optimistic and kind of excited view of these things. But I just want people to, yeah, just to not forget that all of that is kind of part and parcel of scientific and technological advancement.
Well, even the idea of like the half-life of facts, right? There's like a framing on that, like, oh my God, we don't know anything, and all of our knowledge is subject to, overturning. And then there's an opposite view. It says, well, isn't that amazing that we keep learning more and that we keep understanding things at a deeper and deeper level? And like, I think even in our own lifetimes, we're going to understand new things. And so it's, do you want to be excited about it, or do you want to be sort of terrified by it?
Exactly. And I hope that we that we at least most of the time choose the excitement.
Sam, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I had a great time.